The Crying Statue. It was the kind of story that every small town has, an old, half-forgotten legend that people bring up when they want to scare each other. In the town of Ambridge, that story was about the statue of the Weeping Lady. She stood in the middle of St. Mary's Cemetery, her pale marble skin flecked with age, eyes closed as if caught in eternal mourning. Her expression was haunting, almost too real, as though she'd been frozen mid-sob. But it wasn't her beauty or craftsmanship that gave people chills. It was the claim that at night, her eyes opened, and she wept tears of blood. Growing up, I thought it was all nonsense, just a campfire story. But all that changed last fall. It started with the death of my younger sister, Lily. She was only 14, taken too soon in a car accident that left my family shattered. I was in college at the time, and rushing back home felt like moving in a nightmare. When I arrived, I found my parents hollow, as if the light had left their eyes forever. We buried Lily in St. Mary's Cemetery, under the watchful gaze of the Weeping Lady. During the service, I caught myself glancing over at the statue, drawn by her somber presence. There was something unsettling about her face, a sorrow that seemed to understand my pain. It was silly, of course, but in that moment, I felt like the statue was mourning with us. After the funeral, I stayed in Ambridge to help my parents through the first few weeks of grief. I tried to keep myself busy, taking care of chores, handling the house. But at night, when the silence settled over everything, my mind would drift back to Lily, and I felt a pull towards the cemetery. It started out innocent enough. I'd go to her grave during the day, bringing flowers or just sitting by her headstone, talking to her as if she could hear me. But soon, day visits weren't enough. I'd slip out late at night, finding comfort in the quiet cemetery, in the dim lights of the lanterns that lined the pathways. I'd sit by Lily's grave until dawn, whispering memories, as if by some miracle I could bridge the gap between us. It was during one of those nights that I first noticed the statue weeping. I had been sitting next to Lily's grave, lost in thought, when I felt something strange, a subtle but undeniable prickle on the back of my neck, the kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. I looked up and saw her, the Weeping Lady. The moonlight cast shadows on her face, giving her an eerie, almost lifelike appearance. Her head was slightly tilted downwards, as though she were gazing directly at me. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I moved closer, I saw it. Dark red tears were streaming down her cheeks, staining the pristine marble. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, torn between terror and a strange sense of awe. It was as if the statue shared my grief, mirroring my loss. But there was something more, a depth of sorrow that went beyond anything human. I stumbled back, barely making it home. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I wanted to tell someone, but who would believe me? Instead, I lay in bed, replaying the sight over and over until sleep finally claimed me. The next night, I found myself back at the cemetery, unable to resist the pull. Part of me was hoping to catch the statue in the act again, but the logical part of me dismissed it as a hallucination, a trick of the moonlight. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that grief was clouding my mind. But there she was weeping once again. This time, I stayed, watching the slow trickle of red seep down her face. My heart pounded, but I couldn't look away. As I stood there, I heard something, a faint whisper, barely audible. I leaned closer, straining to make out the words, and I realized it was my sister's voice. Alex. I jerked back, my pulse racing. I looked around, but there was no one. I was alone with the statue, the whisper fading into the night air. But I knew what I'd heard. The statue had spoken with my sister's voice. The days that followed were a blur. I stopped eating, barely slept, my every thought consumed by the weeping lady and the voice I'd heard. My parents noticed the change, but I couldn't tell them. They were barely holding on as it was, and I didn't want to burden them with my madness. I felt trapped, unable to escape the pull of the cemetery. Each night, I returned, and each night she wept. The blood-red tears flowed from her eyes, and every time I heard Lily's voice. She was calling to me, her words clearer with each visit. Why did you leave me? Her voice was full of pain, an accusation that twisted a knife in my heart. I wanted to answer her, to tell her that I hadn't left her, that I was here, that I would have done anything to save her. But no words came. I was paralyzed, trapped in the agony of my guilt. One night, as I stood before the weeping lady, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one. My heart raced, my skin cold with fear. Then I heard it again, Lily's voice whispering, "Come closer." I turned back to the statue, and her face seemed different, more vivid, her eyes now wide open, staring directly into mine. I was drawn to her, unable to resist. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold marble. Her tears were warm, sticky, staining my hand with a deep crimson. I looked down, horrified. I could feel the blood seeping into my skin, a burning sensation that spread through my veins. I tried to pull away, but my hand was stuck as if fused to the statue. Panic gripped me, and I struggled, but the harder I pulled, the stronger the statue's grip became. And then the whispering began. It wasn't just Lily's voice anymore. There were others, countless voices, all speaking at once, their words blending into a cacophony of despair. They were pleading, accusing, begging for release. I was overwhelmed, drowning in their sorrow, their pain. I could feel their suffering as if it were my own, a weight that pressed down on me, suffocating. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped in the grip of the statue. Time lost all meaning. I was lost in a sea of voices, each one pulling me deeper, dragging me into the darkness. And then suddenly I was free. I stumbled back, gasping for air, my body shaking. The statue was still, her face once again serene, the blood gone as if it had never been there. But I knew better. I had felt it, seen it. The weeping lady was more than just stone. In the days that followed, I became obsessed with the statue, desperate to understand what I had experienced. I spent hours researching, scouring old town records, hoping to find some clue, some explanation. And finally I found it. The weeping lady had once been a real person, a woman named Eleanor Gray, who had lost her daughter to a tragic accident. Consumed by grief, she had spent the rest of her life mourning at her daughter's grave, refusing to leave, until she too was found dead beside the grave, her face twisted in sorrow. After her death, the townspeople had commissioned the statue in her honor, a tribute to a mother's undying love. But rumors began to spread, rumors that her spirit had somehow fused with the stone, that her grief had seeped into the very marble, trapping her soul for eternity. I knew then that I wasn't crazy. The statue was alive, in a way, a vessel for Eleanor's sorrow, a gateway between the living and the dead. And somehow, in my grief, I had opened that gateway, allowing the voices of the dead to reach me. But the statue's hold on me only grew stronger. Every night, I was drawn back to the cemetery, unable to resist. The whispers became louder, more insistent, their voices echoing in my mind even during the day. I was losing myself, slipping into the same sorrow that had claimed Eleanor. I knew I had to stop, that I had to break free. But I was trapped, caught in the web of grief and guilt that bound me to the statue. I could feel it pulling me closer, drawing me into the darkness. One night, I returned to the cemetery, my mind blank, my body numb. I approached the weeping lady, her face more vivid than ever, her eyes wide open, staring into my soul. I reached out, my hand brushing against her cheek, and I felt a warmth, a pulse, a heartbeat. And then I heard Lily's voice, clear and unmistakable. "Come with me." The darkness closed in, and I felt myself slipping, falling into the void. The last thing I saw was the statue's face, her eyes filled with sorrow, her tears flowing red. And now, I am part of her, a voice among the many, trapped in the stone, forever weeping, forever mourning, waiting for the next soul to wander into the cemetery, to hear the whispers of the weeping lady, and to join us in eternal sorrow.